We come at last to the end of our story. The end of the Second Age. The end of our hypothetical alternate universe Rings of Power TV show. In the last video, I talked about how I would build the final season, Season 5, and so now the time has come to finish it. To adapt a Second Age finale. Maya Govanen Melanin, and welcome to the final installment in this How the Rings of Power Might Have Been Written series. I've already spent 2 hours setting up the War of the Last Alliance and talking through the last handful of episodes, so I'll not waste time going over that again, but at the point where I left off, the climactic Battle of Dagorlad was about to begin. Our last alliance of elves, men, dwarves, birds and beasts have journeyed together all the way down to the Black Gate, to the very doors of Sauron's dominion. Among the elves we have Círdan the Shipwright, Celeborn and Galadriel, King Thranduil of the Woodland Realm, and Elrond. Among the men we have the Dunedain of the North, faithful Haradrim of the south, and Gondor's 2 first kings, Isildur and his younger brother Anarion. The dwarves are led by their semi-mythological king, Durin the Fourth, and by the king's side is his slightly less mythologically profound son, a more regular dwarf called Prince Floey. And among the birds and beasts we have the great eagles and black bears, recruited by Galadriel. But at the very head of the whole thing, we have 2 High Kings. Gil-galad of the Noldor and Elendil of the Dunedain. The last alliance exists because of them. And the war that bears its name will not end until they do. However, despite the size and grandeur of the last alliance that's come to challenge Sauron and end the Second Age, the first battle of this war ended in absolute disaster. In the unfinished tales, we are told about the massacre of the Wood-elves, the Galadrim, who rushed ahead of the Alliance's main host, disobeying the commands of High King Gil-galad, and were then subsequently slaughtered, and their bodies buried in the area that will later become known as the Dead Marshes. In Tolkien's version of events, both the Woodland Kings, Oropher and Armadir, were slain, but for the most part I've tried to avoid leaning too hard on writings that exist outside of what the actual show has the rights to, and so if this were a real TV show we probably wouldn't be able to use those names. So instead of Oropher and Armadir, I adapted a very similar battle scene featuring Orofer's canonical son, Thranduil, and an invented character called Galadorn. At the end of the last video, Galadorn was brutally butchered by orcs, killed, and Thranduil was wounded by an orc arrow. He lay bleeding in the mud, while 2/3 of his woodland folk fell to the barbarity of Mordor. Also, there were Haradrim in this battle. In Lord of the Rings, Elrond tells us that in all the long wars with the Dark Tower, treason has ever been our greatest foe. However, there is very little in the way of actual lore to support that statement, so I included a subplot featuring 2 different factions of Haradrim, those who fought with the Alliance against Sauron beneath their king's banner of a red hawk, and those who betrayed the last alliance under the banner of the Black Serpent. While many of Thranduil's Wood-elves were being slaughtered by the orcs, many of the faithful Haradrim were being slaughtered by the treason of their own countrymen. For a moment, it's looking like the last alliance came all this way just to be defeated in their first battle. Lesser kings might have looked upon the massacre of the Galadrim and the Haradrim and slunk back home to spare themselves a similar fate. But not Gil-galad, not Elendil, and not Durin the Fourth. As the hosts of Mordor reach out to snatch their victory, it slips from their grasp. the sun rises, and the combined armies of the Noldor, and the Dunedain, and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, and the great eagles and the black bears of the wild all arrive upon the battle plain to save what remains of their alliance. The last alliance of all three peoples versus the full might of Mordor. And thus begins the Battle of Dagorlad. Now, the Battle of Dagorlad is kind of what's being adapted in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings prologue, although in the movies that battle is kind of smushed together with the Siege of Barad-dûr and the cutting of the ring from Sauron's finger. However, in Tolkien's writings, these are all separate events, and the Battle of Dagorlad is the one that comes first. So, this battle is not fought within the confines of Mordor, it is fought outside the Black Gate, on the exact same battle plane where Aragorn will lead the hosts of the West towards the end of the Lord of the Rings. And I guess the main thing to say about the Battle of Dagorlad is that it is by far the biggest battle of the Second Age. It's bigger than any battle of the Third Age. I imagine this will be the action crescendo of the whole story. This is like the Battle of the Morannon times 10,000. Together, Gil-galad and Elendil lead a monumentally epic charge into the ranks of the enemy. All who stand against Gil-galad's icy spear Aeglos and Elendil's First Age sword Narsil are immediately cut down. With blades that all glow blue, the elves of Lindon sweep through the orcs like fire through a field of reeds. This is the battle that Gil-galad's been preparing for since his very first scene. At his right-hand side stands his friend and mentor Círdan the Shipwright, and at his left is Elrond, Lord of Imladris. Generally, I do like to prioritize, themes and character stuff over, cool factor, but this is the epic battle towards the end of the final season, so if there ever were a time to place style over substance and just kind of showcase elves being badasses, it would be now. Perhaps we can throw in some, armoured trolls or some other elite baddies for the Noldor to take down, and we can demonstrate just how loyal and capable and unbelievably cool Elrond and Círdan are when push comes to shove, Gil-galad's right-hand elves. Also, don't forget about Celeborn. I know the Noldor do typically get most of the focus, but Celeborn is a very cool warrior from among the Sindar, and he's been a key part of the Second Age story since the very beginning of the first season. Although I imagine the most important thing for Celeborn to do in this Dagorlad episode would begin with avenging Galadhorn and the dead Galadhrim, but then as he fights his way through the orcs, he finds Thranduil, injured but alive. His focus shifts. We see that Celeborn has the wisdom to set vengeance aside, and instead he prioritizes protecting his fellow Lord of the Sindar, Thranduil, and ensuring that at least some of the Wood-elves do survive this battle. Just like his wife Galadriel, Celeborn has grown into a guardian, protecting people less powerful than himself. Anyway, among the Dunedain, we see a similar thing to the Gil-galad, Elrond, and Círdan badassery. Elendil, Isildur, and Anarion, a trinity of awesome, all three kings of the Númenórean kingdoms in exile, avenging the ruin that Sauron brought upon their homeland. But among the vast armies of Mordor, we should see that not all those who fight for Sauron are orcs. Variags of Khand, corrupted men of Rhûn, evil men of the north, all over Middle-earth there will always be some men who embrace the deceptions of the Dark Lord, but all over Middle-earth there will always be some men who resist him. Sauron's relationship with the race of men is considerably more complex than his relationship with any other group of people, and the Battle of Dagorlad is both a climax to Sauron's Second Age meddling in mortal affairs, but it's also set up for all the conflicts that are gonna plague the men of Gondor and Harad and Rhûn throughout all of the Third Age. I think we can illustrate the dawn of these future conflicts by showing a duel to the death between the treacherous Haradrim Lord of the Black Serpent and Anarion, King of Gondor and friend to the now murdered faithful Haradrim King of the Red Hawk. As battle rages all around them, Anarion finds the Black Serpent upon the field of slaughter, and the two warrior kings become locked in single combat, man on man. In the end, Anarion gets the upper hand, and his big hero moment comes by slaying the Black Serpent and avenging the faithful men of Harad. I imagine most viewers would simply take this duel at face value, but if you are particularly familiar with The Lord of the Rings, then you'll know that I haven't invented this whole Black Serpent thing among the Haradrim out of nothing. In the Battle of Pelennor Fields chapter, we are told that when King Theoden and the Rohirrim charged to the defense of Minas Tirith, the main force of the Haradrim gathered around the standard of their chieftain. He was filled with a red wrath, and displaying his standard, Black Serpent upon Scarlet, he came against the white horse of Theoden. This Third Age Black Serpent among the Haradrim is eventually slain in one-on-one combat by warrior King Theoden himself, but I quite like the implication that this Black Serpent represents not an individual, but a sinister idea among the Haradrim going back millennia. If Anarion, Gondor's first king, killed the original Black Serpent back in the Battle of Dagorlad, it might explain, to an extent, a part of why so many men of Harad are still fighting against Gondor 3,000 years later. Perhaps we could suggest that the many great wars between Gondor and Harad in the Third Age are in part legacies of quite a personal conflict going back all the way to the end of the Second Age. However, among the many orcs and men in the armies of Mordor, we also have wargs and werewolves. And although werewolves may seem like an exclusively First Age Silmarillion thing, in Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf tells Frodo that in the service of Barad-dûr there are wargs and werewolves, so no issues with copyright. Tolkien's werewolves are of course quite a bit different from the popular 21st century idea of a werewolf. They are not dudes who shapeshift in the full moon. These Middle-earth werewolves are ancient, dreadful spirits that are housed or potentially trapped inside the bodies of giant evil wolves. And who doesn't want to see a giant werewolf fighting a giant black bear in the middle of the Second Age's most climactic battle? While those two great beasts are locked in combat on the ground, above them, Gwaihir the Windlord takes down the greatest of Sauron's flying fell beasts, and the other great birds rid the skies of evil things. Like I said, subtle storytelling is vital to any Tolkien adaptation, but I will be the first to admit that this probably isn't the best example of that. Giant birds and beasts taking each other out in the middle of a massive battle perhaps isn't, the most highbrow intellectual thing that I could possibly pitch, but it would be cool. Anyway, the final faction in our last alliance is, of course, the Dwarves of Khazad-dûm, a coalition of Durin's folk, dwarves of the Blue Mountains, dwarves of Gundabad, and even dwarves of the Iron Hills, all united under the banner of their semi-divine king, Durin IV. I imagine the bulk of Khazad-dûm's dwarven army would be led by Durin's son, Prince Floey, while King Durin would be fighting at the head of like a royal vanguard made up of ultra-elite warriors. These super dwarven badasses are the first to break through the ranks of the enemy, and while the rest of the alliance are forming battle lines, Durin's vanguard pushes ahead, hewing through the sea of orcs further and further towards the Black Gate. But they are massively outnumbered, and from the Black Land pours more and more of Sauron's reinforcements. As Durin's super dwarves get close, the Black Gate closes, and the elite vanguard of King Durin find themselves face to face with the armies of the Dark Dwarves from those other two houses, the dwarves who swore loyalty to Sauron. So, in the midst of the Battle of Dagorlad, we have 3 dwarven kings, each wearing one of the 3 dwarven rings of power. King Durin IV's relatively small vanguard of elites is surrounded by the much larger forces of the Dark Dwarves. And before the Black Gate of Mordor, they begin a battle to the death. Masses of Dark Dwarves are slain by Durin and his elites, but eventually both sides are whittled down to just a few. And then finally, King Durin IV stands alone. The bodies of his warriors surround him, but they are buried beneath a heap of bodies belonging to their foes. Durin is weary and wounded, but he fights on, slaying dwarf after dwarf who comes against him, taking wound after wound. Eventually, most of his enemies are dead, but Durin can barely stand. The 2 kings of these Dark Dwarves approach. They stand over Durin and raise their axes. Durin looks across the battlefield and he sees his son, Floey. Floey sees him. Their eyes meet. Durin clutches his axe in both hands and he faces death with dignity. But neither of these Dark Dwarven kings strike the killing blow. They just look at him. Durin, the 4th reincarnation of the Deathless, the first dwarf ever, laid down in the earth by the creator of their entire race. Durin isn't just some enemy king, he is a mythological figure. His significance to dwarven culture transcends the last alliance. It transcends any loyalty these Dark Dwarves may have sworn to Sauron. These guys may be wicked, they may be greedy and somewhat villainous, but I just don't believe that any dwarf would fall so far as to execute Durin with such dishonor as this. Tolkien explicitly tells us that the race of dwarves are the most difficult race for any Dark Lord to dominate. They are the hardiest against corruption. They resist their rings of power in a way that Sauron did not foresee as being possible. After all, there are no mini dwarven Nazgûl. Dwarves may be tempted to go along with evil out of greed or for the sake of pride and ambition, but they do not worship Sauron. His will never dominates theirs. So, I think these Dark Dwarven kings should simply look down at the masses of dwarven dead by their feet. They should look at the dwarves they've killed and the dwarves they've led to die in Sauron's war, and they should look at Durin. Even dwarves in the service of Mordor will not murder the Deathless for the sake of some promise to some Dark Lord. They put down their axes, they leave the battlefield, and they return into the east, never to engage in the wars of Sauron again. However, putting a major character like Durin in an unsurvivable situation and then having him survive due to something that he had absolutely no control over is, quite frankly, weak writing. So, unfortunately, I do think Durin's got to die. As the Dark Dwarves depart and Flowey fights his way through the swarming enemies to reach his father's side, a rush of orc arrows flies down from the Black Gate, and Durin IV is struck just as Flowey reaches him. The dwarves make a defensive shield wall to protect their king, but Durin dies in the arms of his son. With his final breath, he bestows his ring of power, the Ring of Durin, to Flowey. And when Flowey rises again, he is the new king of Khazad-dûm. Now, Tolkien doesn't really give us any specifics on how the Battle of Dagorlad should go, but in the Passage of the Marshes chapter of The Lord of the Rings, we are told they fought on the plain for days and months at the Black Gates. Which means, if we want to be faithful to the source material, we should demonstrate that this battle lasts for months. So there should be a camp. There should be a place where some soldiers of the Last Alliance can rest and recover, whilst the others are out fighting. I imagine both Gil-galad and Elendil are almost constantly out fighting, but the rest of the army does need to fight in shifts. It is the only way that a battle like this could go on for months. And I imagine that in this camp, Galadriel would be the most important figure. Her powers are in restoration and preservation. She can heal, she can strengthen morale and kindle resistance. For a soldier recovering from a long day of battle, facing a night of dread within earshot of the ceaseless battle he knows he must return to, a presence like Galadriel would be the difference between victory and defeat. She is a living, breathing source of hope. Her power over the spirit keeps the Alliance going, day after day after day, and the armies of Mordor have no equivalent. They fight out of fear of Sauron. The Alliance fights because they are blessed by Galadriel. I imagine that she would be a big part of why they win. Anyway, after the death of Durin, we do need a sober scene, a funeral in this camp. And a funeral for Galadhorn and the King of the Red Hawk too. This battle is pretty epic, and there's plenty of cool stuff to, get excited about, but glorifying war, that's not what Tolkien was about. And although there can be great victory in war, there is always a great cost. In Middle-earth, war is sometimes necessary, but it's never good. The overwhelming number of dead require vast grave sites to bury them. Elves and men and dwarves and birds and beasts all lie in the ground together, and many of the survivors suffer permanent wounds and mental damage. Obviously, we know that Thranduil is going to survive, and his battle scars will eventually heal, but the scars on his psyche, they will last another 3,000 years. Tolkien understood the trauma of war better than the average person, and I think it would be a disservice to him to not at least allude to that. However, eventually, the Battle of Dagorlad does come to an end, and after months of attrition, the battle plain before Mordor is finally cleared of Sauron's servants. Gil-galad and Elendil, Elrond and Isildur, Círdan, Anarion and Flowey all stand before the Black Gate, and they all face the reality that on the other side lies their final challenge. The Siege of Barad-dûr. Now, Tolkien never actually reveals how exactly the Last Alliance made it through the Black Gate, but by taking inspiration from a similar-ish moment in the appendices, I think we can invent something pretty cool. Thousands of years after this moment, Galadriel will journey to Sauron's old fortress of Dol Guldur, and she will use her elvish magic to throw down its walls and lay it bare, right at the end of the Third Age. Also, thousands of years before this moment, Luthien Tinuviel did a very similar thing to Sauron's island of werewolves in the Silmarillion. So, there is a Tolkienian precedent for immensely powerful magical elven women to use their power to throw down Sauron's walls after he suffered a major defeat. Now, it would be a little bit law-breaking for Galadriel to tear down the Black Gate, but I think this could very well be her big hero moment in the War of the Last Alliance. She puts forth all her power, and a part of the walls of Mordor crumble before her. The effort weakens her, but thanks to Galadriel's power over the unseen, the armies of the Last Alliance are finally able to enter Mordor. Now, as they do, I'm imagining a scene from Sauron's perspective, where he stands outside the doors of Barad-dûr and watches the Last Alliance charge through the dark valley of Udun and emerge upon the plateau of Gorgoroth in his realm. And at the head of his enemies are two high kings, thundering towards Barad-dûr. Sauron stares at them. Gil-galad, the guy who robbed him of victory back in Season 1, the king who could not be deceived. And Elendil, the guy Tolkien tells us Sauron hated most in all of Middle-earth, the leader of the faithful, living proof that Sauron's corruption of Númenor wasn't really worth the price he paid for it. The Dúnedain yet live, and here they are, on his doorstep. Elendil, Isildur, and Anarion. These aren't just leaders of the opposition, these are very personal thorns in Sauron's side. And Gil-galad, Círdan, Elrond, if these guys had been a little bit weaker-willed back in the beginning, Sauron would have won 2,000 years ago. But instead, they stood against him. They're still standing against him, and now Sauron must surely be aware that as long as they live, he will never truly be the Lord of the Earth. As the Alliance draws near the Dark Tower, Sauron steps inside and the Dark Door closes. A hail of arrows rain down from the walls and the kings of the Alliance halt just out of range. Sauron can't beat them in open battle, but they can't reach him in his tower. I imagine Galadriel would once again put forth her power and try to break the doors of Barad-dûr. But this time it's different. The power of the One Ring went into the building of Barad-dûr, and as mighty as Galadriel may be, she cannot rival that sort of power. There is an awesome moment in The Lord of the Rings when the Fellowship are in Moria and Gandalf faces off against the Balrog for the first time. There's a dwarf door between them, so they're not actually face to face, but they do both have kind of one hand on the handle, and they do go toe to toe against each other magically. Gandalf speaks words of command to try and lock the door behind him, but the Balrog is on the other side, wielding magic of his own to counter Gandalf's spell. Two Maiar locked in a magical battle of wills. Eventually, the door bursts into pieces, and Gandalf later tells the Fellowship, "I have met my match and have nearly been destroyed. I have never felt such a challenge, it nearly broke me." So, that's what I'm kind of taking inspiration from with this next scene. Galadriel stands outside the doors of Barad-dûr. She puts forth her power and tries to tear them down, but on the other side stands Sauron, challenging her spells, wielding the One Ring. He may not be the world's greatest warrior, but in a contest like this, Sauron is at his most dangerous. Even more so than Gandalf against the Balrog, Galadriel should be really magically, spiritually wounded. If she continues, she will be destroyed. Now, perhaps the Galadriel of Season 1 would have kept going. Her ambition and her pride might have deceived her into believing that she was Sauron's equal, but by Season 5, pride has given way to wisdom. That is Galadriel's character arc. She is shaken by her confrontation, but not broken by it. She pulls back before Sauron's will can dominate her own, and she accepts that it is not her destiny to fight Sauron physically. Instead, she will fight him indirectly, non-stop for thousands of years. She will enhance the strength of his enemies. She will slowly move the wheels of the world in such a way that his victory will never be complete. In over 3,000 years' time, Galadriel will give her Starglass to Frodo Baggins, and when his quest is at its darkest, the light given by Galadriel will see him through to the very end. He will destroy the One Ring, Sauron will be vanquished, and Galadriel will be there at the very end to cleanse Dol Guldur of his evil. And we can demonstrate Galadriel's growth here by showing the Siege of Barad-dûr from both perspectives. She may have lost her physical duel with Sauron, but her presence is still giving the Last Alliance hope and morale and the will to keep going. They are besieging Barad-dûr from a position of strength because Galadriel is among them. Sauron's Orc Horde, on the other hand, they hate him, and he hates them. But now they are all trapped inside the Dark Tower with the Dark Lord, living every day in fear. All Sauron has left is the certainty that his servants fear him more than their enemy. He has large reserves of meat and maggoty bread to feed to his army, but it will not last forever. He has vast stores of ammunition, but not infinite. And although he has legions of lives to throw away, he is under siege. His resources are only going to diminish. He is skating on thin ice. Now, if we treat Tolkien's timeline as sacred, then we do need another time jump here, as we are told that the Siege of Barad-dûr actually lasts for 7 years. However, I can understand that maybe a 7-year time jump right as the plot reaches its climax might be an unconventional choice for a TV show. Although, as the penultimate episode begins, we do need to establish that at least some time has passed. This siege is a long one. If we're not afraid of the 7 years, then we could potentially cut briefly back to Arnor and illustrate what a country looks like 7 years after all its men went to war. Soroniel is queen in Elendil's stead, and for 7 years she's been holding together a realm of women and children and the elderly and other non-combatants. Also, we could show little Valandil back in Rivendell, now 7 years old, and we can explore how shared experiences of war and peace have really strengthened the bond of friendship between Eärien and Celebrian. But the main point of the penultimate episode is the climax of the War of the Last Alliance. That's what I'm gonna focus on. Over the span of the siege, Sauron sent out many sorties of malnourished orcs to try and break the vigilance of the defenders, and he launched tens of thousands of arrows and stones and javelins, but now, X amount of time later, the attacks have ceased. Barad-dûr seems silent. The Last Alliance closes in, ready for the final moments of their war. The door of the Dark Tower slowly opens. Sauron emerges to face his foes, and the kings of the Last Alliance ride to meet him. Gil-galad, Elendil, Isildur, Anarion, and Flói of Khazad-dûm. And, I imagine this scene could be a sort of sequel to Season 5's cold opening. Gil-galad tells Sauron to kneel, repent, be humble, beg for pardon. One last chance to forswear the evil that he has done. But Sauron will not beg. He glares at the kings of his enemies. He looks southwest towards Mount Doom, and then comes his final, sudden onslaught. Every arrow, every spear, every stone is loosed. Every orc pours from the Dark Tower, and they crash like a wave upon the Alliance. As a cloud of projectiles rains down, the kings take cover, and Sauron takes flight. It is only 30 miles from Barad-dûr to Mount Doom, and if Sauron could get to it, if he could get to the Samath Naur, the cracks of Doom, the forge where the One Ring was made, he could potentially use the mountain to cover all his foes in fire and ruin. He can still snatch a win. He just has to get to Mount Doom. But as the orcs flood from Barad-dûr and the final battle of the Last Alliance begins, Gil-galad sees through Sauron's gambit, and so does Elendil. While the armies of good and evil clash, the two High Kings depart together, speeding as fast as they can in pursuit of Sauron. The Second Age is going to end with these three kings. However, sticking with the actual battle for a moment, this is the second to last episode of the whole show. All our important characters should get at least one more moment in the spotlight. So, Elrond, Círdan, Celeborn, Gwaihir, Flói, and the Chief of the Bears, they all get a chance to show off just how awesome they are. Also, the younger generation of Gondorian princes, Elendur and Meneldil, Aratan and Cirion. But the most important character to focus on here is, and always has been, Isildur. He narrowly dodges the spears and stones of Barad-dûr, and he cuts a path through the swarming orcs. Anarion does the same, and in the midst of the slaughter, the two brothers meet. They exchange a nod, a meaningful look. Anarion smiles at Isildur, and then a javelin strikes him through the heart. Just like that. Anarion, brother of Isildur, king of Gondor, dead. Right at the end of the war. That isn't exactly how it goes in Tolkien's writings. We are told that Anarion was actually slain by a stone cast from Barad-dûr that crushed his skull and his crown, but that's written in quite an obscure part of the Peoples of Middle-earth, and it's probably a bit too specific to be copyright-proof. However, I don't think the specifics of the projectile is what's important in adapting Anarion's death. What matters is the randomness. Anarion is a major character. He's been an important part of the story since Season 3, and although he's certainly not the only major character who's gonna die in this episode, he is the only one who is killed without any kind of a final stand. Typically, when Tolkien kills a major character, it is, epic. But I think the real tragedy of Anarion's death is that it doesn't come in some game-changing one-on-one duel. It isn't an astoundingly heroic sacrifice. It's a random casualty of chaos. A soldier slain arbitrarily by some stray missile. It might not be the most cinematic way to go, but I think the sudden, shocking death of Anarion is representative of something very realistic. Again, Tolkien was not ambiguous about this. War is not glorious, and in battle no one is safe from the haphazard nature of misfortune. And so, in the moment that Anarion fights his way to Isildur's side, he is suddenly slain, and Isildur never gets a chance to speak any last words to him. He's just abruptly left without a brother. Which is what I think should be going through Isildur's head as this episode moves forward, he's just watched Anarion die. And it doesn't matter how many orcs he kills, that won't ever balance the scale. As he battles to defend Anarion's body, Isildur is joined by Elrond and Círdan. The other chieftains of the Alliance rally to their side, and under the combined command of Isildur, Elrond, Círdan, Celeborn, Gwaihir, and Flói, the armies of the last Alliance gain the upper hand. The Orc legions break, and they scatter north and south into the hinterland of Mordor. The battle is won, but it's not yet over. If the Orcs aren't hunted, they will return all the more hateful. But it's not Orcs who occupy Isildur's thoughts. It may have been by their hand that Anarion was slain, but it was Sauron who killed him. Isildur looks southwest, and far off in the distance he sees his father and Gil-galad, drawing ever nearer the Mountain of Fire. Which brings us to the climax of all 5 seasons, one of the biggest moments that this show should really have been building to from the beginning. Gil-galad and Elendil, Aeglos and Narsil, Noldor and Númenor versus Sauron. They have earned this confrontation, and it is upon the slopes of Mount Doom that the High Kings of the Last Alliance finally come to the deciding battle of their lives. If Sauron can just get to the Samath Naur, he's won. If Elendil and Gil-galad can just stop him, they've won. It all comes down to this. As the High Kings draw near, Sauron turns. There are only 2 of them, and he wields the power of the ruling ring. He lifts his hand, and a ring of flame surrounds all 3 of them. Whatever happens next, they aren't all leaving this ring. And when the flames die down, the Second Age will end. Interestingly, this is another thing where Tolkien never ever tells us about Sauron ever wielding any kind of a conventional weapon. If he had a sword or a spear or a mace in this fight, we are never told about it. The only weapons Sauron is ever described as wielding are obviously the One Ring, and also, in this moment, the heat of his hand. That is what he will use to kill. And I actually think this fight scene might be more memorable, or at least less generic, if Sauron doesn't have a blade with which to defend against Aeglos and Narsil, but Gil-galad and Elendil don't have power with which to defend against the heat of Sauron's hand. All 3 of them are playing to their strengths. And the greatest strength that Elendil and Gil-galad have, the one massive advantage that these 2 incarnate beings have against a Maya spirit like Sauron, is each other. The union of Gil-galad and Elendil is at the core of everything in Season 5, and the union of Noldor and Númenóreans is at the core of the entire show. Narsil and Aeglos are so in sync. These 2 kings move and fight and defend as one. If you picture the most epic fight scene ever, that's kind of what this should be. The spear-wielding warrior king of the Noldor, High King Starlight, and Elendil, elf friend, lover of stars, wielder of Narsil, bearer of the Ring of Barahir, lord of the faithful, scion of Silmarillane, heir of Elros, High King of the Númenóreans in exile. Together, these 2 badasses take down Sauron. Now, for the sake of portraying this as Tolkien wrote it, during the fight, Isildur should arrive at Mount Doom to witness it, Elrond and Círdan too. But they are on the outside of this fiery ring, so they cannot lend aid to their kings. All they can do is watch. Gil-galad and Elendil inflict many superficial injuries upon the Dark Lord, but there is only one way to vanquish him. They must each land a mortal blow, a wound from which Sauron cannot recover. And to achieve that, it will cost them their lives. Without a word being spoken, the kings recognize this fact in unison. Elendil swings at the Dark Lord, and as Sauron pulls back, Gil-galad leaps forward and he thrusts his spear into Sauron's chest. Sauron goes down, but he catches Gil-galad by the throat, and with the heat of his hand and the power of his ring, Sauron burns the life from the last High King of the Noldor. Both Gil-galad and Sauron give everything they have to take down the other. As fire consumes Gil-galad, he plunges his icy spear deeper into the Dark Lord. As Sauron suffers the agony of Iagloss, he puts forth the rest of his power and burns Gil-galad to death. The Elven King falls upon the slopes of Mount Doom, and Sauron kneels by his remains, crippled and broken. Then Elendil comes up behind him, and when he thrusts Narsil through the Dark Lord's back, he avenges every one of the faithful who were human sacrificed in Melkor's temple. He avenges all the gardens and libraries that now lie beneath the ocean, and he makes Sauron suffer for the downfall of Númenor. The Dark Lord lets out a terrible cry, and with the last shred of his Maya might, he slays Elendil where he stands, and Narsil breaks beneath him as he falls. The High King of all Dúnedain lies dead beside the High King of the Noldor, but in between them kneels Sauron, impaled through the chest by Iagloss and impaled through the back by the broken blade of Narsil. The fiery ring dies down. Sauron's enemies are dead, and yet he is thrown down too. The one ring glows red upon his finger, the only thing binding his spirit to his vanquished body. And then Isildur steps forward. He takes the broken hilt of Narsil from his father's lifeless hand, and he looks at the ring of Barahir upon his father's finger. Then he looks into Sauron's red eye. This is the guy who killed Anarion, who killed Elendil, who conquered Minas Ithil, who burned the White Tree of Gondor, burned the White Tree of Númenor, brought ruin to Isildur's homeland, brought death to thousands of his countrymen, and once dared to declare himself the king of all men. This is the guy Isildur's ancestors have been fighting for thousands of years. The guy who burned the Entwives, who ruled the Dark Years, who plunged Middle-earth into war. Sauron looks back at Isildur. Isildur grips his father's broken blade, and then, as an act of execution, he cuts the ring from Sauron's finger. The Dark Lord's spirit of malice rises from his vanquished body. It forsakes his physical form, looks back at Isildur and the broken blade that brought about its downfall. And then Sauron departs and vanishes beyond the wastes of Mordor. Finally, he is gone, and he will not take physical form again for at least 1,000 years. Just like that, the Second Age is over. The One Ring passes to Isildur. He picks it up from the side of the mountain, and he slowly closes his gloved hand around it. Then he glances back at Elrond and Círdan, the only two people in the world who saw him take it. And this could very well be the end of the show. It is kind of the climax of the plot, but it's not the climax of the story. There's still more that needs to be told, and so I reckon we need one more episode, a finale, called Isildur's Bane. The final episode opens on Barad-dûr. The War of the Last Alliance is over. The Black Land is cleansed and the masterless orcs flee north to disperse into cracks and crevices beneath the earth. But the Dark Tower cannot be wholly thrown down. It is sacked by the armies of the Alliance, and because Sauron no longer bears the ruling ring, the other rings of power can now be used by their keepers. So Círdan, Elrond, and Galadriel are able to use their elvish rings to try and rid Barad-dûr of the evil that still lingers there. And the tower is broken, but its foundations remain. For Barad-dûr was imbued with the power of the One Ring, and the One Ring endures. Before the victorious alliance finally leaves Mordor, there needs to be a private scene between Isildur, Elrond, and Círdan. Isildur now has two rings. The Ring of Barahir that he inherited from his father, and the One Ring, taken from Sauron. He holds each in one hand and stares at them both. The Ring of Barahir is not a ring of power, it is a symbol of the faithful, a symbol of Númenor, a symbol of abiding friendship between elves and men. It is a good ring. The other ring is sinister as balls, but Isildur cannot stop staring at it. He closes both hands and claims both rings as his own, both heirlooms of the Dunedain, to be passed down from king to king throughout all the rest of this newly dawned Third Age. However, Isildur's very close friend and fellow ring-bearer, Elrond, counsels him not to keep it. It was made by Sauron, to be wielded by him alone. It will suffer no other master. Let it go. But Isildur can't do it. And although we know this is the wrong decision, Isildur does have good justification for keeping it. In Lord of the Rings, the One Ring is considered a weregild. It is a man price that must be paid to compensate the lost lives of Elendil and Anarion, and all the other Dunedain who fell before Isildur cut this ring from Sauron's vanquished hand. Wereguilds aren't really a thing anymore, but they were an important part of that very old-school Anglo-Saxon culture of honour and restitution. Basically, way back in the day, every person had a monetary value, and if that person were killed, then their value, their weregild, must be paid by their killer to their family. Everyone's value was different, there is a real hierarchy to it, but kings always had the highest weregild. The debt that was incurred for killing a king was immense, and Sauron just killed 2 kings of the Dunedain. Also, the drowning of Númenor. So the One Ring really is the only thing that could be considered a worthy weregild. By right of law, it must be paid to the Dunedain. And I think it's very important that we demonstrate Isildur isn't making this point because he's angry or vengeful that his father and brother are dead. His personal feelings are irrelevant. He disagrees with Elrond because he perceives that that is his duty. He argues that it would be an insult to the memory of those dead Dunedain kings if their were-guild were cast away. It was paid for with their lives, and so from Isildur's perspective, the One Ring really isn't his to destroy. It should be an heirloom of the Dunedain, just like the shards of Narsil, or the Ring of Barahir, or the Silver Scepter of Silmarien. As the current king of the Dunedain, Isildur is a custodian of these heirlooms, but it is not for him to cast any of them away. They belong to his heirs. But Círdan backs up Elrond's argument. He warns Isildur that Sauron's ring belongs to Sauron. It is treacherous, and he says if you claim it, it will bring ruin to your house and to all the heirs of Isildur. Ultimately, I think this respectful disagreement is another example of the difference between a mortal and a deathless perspective. One prioritizes legacy, the other long-term well-being. And I think Isildur's rationalization of why he should keep the One Ring should feature very similar language to Celebrimbor's justification of forging rings of power in the first place back in Season 1. Isildur says they now stand at the dawn of a new age. This ring could be used for good, to build unparalleled greatness in Middle-earth, an echo of the glory of the West from whence they came. Not only will it exist for millennia to come, it will define this new age. A third age, an age of the ring. Círdan and Elrond counsel Isildur one last time, please, take the weapon of the enemy to the fires where it was forged, and let it be unmade. But Isildur refuses. He appreciates very much the wisdom in their words, but he says it is folly to cast away such a power without even trying to understand it. Isildur will take the ring to Gondor. He will study its nature and its potential, and then he will decide its doom. And so, despite the counsel of Círdan and Elrond, Isildur claims the One Ring as an heirloom of the Dunedain, and he makes the very fateful decision to take it away from Mordor and to let it endure. Which brings us to the beginning of our long ending. Tolkien loved a long ending, and I think it is a very important part of what makes his writings feel so grand and memorable. Things don't just kind of wrap up after the defeat of the bad guy. There is always a return journey. And one of my absolute favourite chapters in The Lord of the Rings, one of the most underrated chapters in my mind, is Many Partings. The third chapter after the ring is destroyed and Sauron is defeated, but still 4 chapters before, the actual end. And Many Partings is so wonderful because it begins in Minas Tirith, with pretty much every single one of our surviving major characters all united, all in the same place at the same time, all interacting with each other. But over the course of that chapter, most of our characters leave the city. And then, one by one, our familiar faces peel away and say their farewells. They depart the story one by one until finally, by the end of the chapter, we are left with just our 4 hobbits and Gandalf, setting off on the final stage of their homeward journey. And I think there's an opportunity to do a similar thing with this ending. After the Alliance leaves Mordor, the obvious place for them to go and recover before parting ways is Osgiliath. And so, everyone who survived the War of the Last Alliance comes to Osgiliath, and they are joined by Earien and Valandil and Celebrian and Soroniel and all our other non-combatant characters. There should be a big celebration of victory, but there should also be a somber reflection on the magnitude of their loss. Galadhorn, Durin IV, Anarion, Gil-galad, Elendil, many men of Harad, elves of the woodland, dwarves of many different houses, birds and beasts, all people have paid a massive price to resist the dominion of Sauron, and with the fighting done, that cost must be felt. We're never told what happened to Gil-galad's body. In fact, Tolkien wrote that Sauron didn't just kill Gil-galad with the heat of his hand, he destroyed him. And where he dwelleth none can say. So it's possible Gil-galad doesn't actually have a body, but he does still need a funeral of some kind. So does Elendil, and so does Anarion. Tolkien wrote that Isildur came to Anarion city, Minas Anor, and it was in his brother's memory that he planted that seedling of the white tree, which he rescued from Minas Ithil before it was conquered by the Nazgûl. And here, in a courtyard of Minas Anor, Isildur's white tree will be tended by the heirs of Anarion for the next 1,500 years. In fact, it is a dead sapling of this very white tree that will one day stand in Minas Tirith's Court of the Fountain during the Lord of the Rings. Also, I know I haven't mentioned her a huge amount, but I'm sure there would be a lovely moment here for our semi-invented character, Soroniel, wife of Elendil and mother of Anarion, who's not only lost 2 kings, but also a husband and a son. She is the matriarch of a family in mourning, and for Soroniel especially, Season 5 really is an unrelentingly tragic story. And yet, until Isildur rides north to succeed his father Elendil, Soroniel is the Queen Regent of Arnor. Anyway, whilst the Dunedain are mourning Anarion and Elendil, we should also see an immortal perspective on death and funerals playing parallel to it. Because for Elrond and Círdan, the passing of High King Gil-galad would be particularly painful. Gil-galad was the original bearer of Elrond's Ring of Power. He was like a mentor to Elrond, and Círdan was like a mentor to Gil-galad. He raised him through his youth, thousands of years ago in the First Age. In some ways, for Círdan, it must be a bit like losing a son. And the elephant in the room here, I guess, is that Gil-galad had no heir. So who's going to be the next High King of the Noldor? Círdan tells Elrond that should he wish it, it could be him. He has the strongest claim. High King Elrond. Elrond looks long at Aeglos, but then he shakes his head and places it upon Gil-galad's tomb. No, it is better not so. But if Círdan wished it, he could succeed Gil-galad as the Elf King of Lindon. But Círdan is of a like mind to Elrond. The alliance is over now. The Middle Days are over now, and throughout this new Third Age, an age of men, Círdan shall be the shipwright. Elrond shall be the Lord of Imladris, and Gil-galad shall be the last of the High Kings of the Noldor. But when the somberness and the celebration have both passed, the time finally comes for the last alliance to disband, for our fellowship of heroes to break and go their separate ways. King Floey bids Elrond and Isildur farewell, and then he leads his dwarven army north out of Gondor, up the Silverlode River, and eventually back home to Khazad-dûm. And I know that Khazad-dûm is going to take quite a dark turn, literally as well as figuratively, between now and the time of The Lord of the Rings, but the Balrog, Durin's Bane, who ruins everything for everyone, he won't wake up until the reign of Durin VI, which is almost 2,000 years after the end of the Second Age. So at this moment, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm actually get a pretty happy ending. They are returning with heavy losses, but they are returning victorious. And under the rule of Khazad-dûm's new king, Flói, the dwarves of Durin's folk are about to enter an almost 2,000-year-long golden age of wealth and prosperity, the likes of which Middle-earth shall not ever see again. A few days after the dwarves depart Osgiliath, it is time for the Galadhrim to return to their homes too. But this ending is quite a bit more heartbreaking than what Flói and the dwarves got. In the case of Thranduil, 2/3 of the elves who followed him out of the Greenwood were killed in what turned out to be a pointless battle. He went forth to war without fully appreciating the horrors he was getting himself in for, and I think this kind of survivor's guilt mixed with trauma is an interesting place to leave his character in the final episode. In the Unfinished Tales, Tolkien wrote, "There was in Thranduil's heart a still deeper shadow. He had seen the horror of Mordor and could not forget it. If ever he looked south, its memory dimmed the light of the sun. And though he knew that it was now broken and deserted, fear spoke in his heart that it was not conquered forever." After the War of the Last Alliance, Thranduil removes his capital all the way up into the very northernmost part of the Greenwood, far, far away from Mordor, but also far from their kin in the Golden Wood, who they were once so connected to. The Sylvan elves who followed Galadhorn out of the Golden Wood are now returning home without a king. They retreat deep into their forest, completely isolating themselves from the rest of the world. The great woodland bridge that once united the two elven kingdoms is now cut down by the fearful Galadhrim. In their eyes, everything east of the river is a threat. I guess the story of the woodland elves in this show is a pretty sad one. But it takes them to the point we'll find them at in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. In The Hobbit, Tolkien wrote that if Thranduil's elves have a fault, it is distrust of strangers. They were more dangerous and less wise. But it's not all bad news for the Galadhrim, because although the elves of the Golden Wood no longer have their king, Galadhorn, they do have a lord and a lady. Right in the heart of the Golden Wood, Galadriel and Celeborn return to their glade of Malorn trees, and finally, Galadriel is free to enrich this land with the power of her elven ring, to make a land of preservation that is utterly free of evil, just as she and Celebrimbor talked about way back in the beginning. Sort of like an anti-Mordor, hidden deep inside the Golden Wood. Back in Season 1, the driving force of Galadriel's character was her desire to become a super powerful woodland queen like Melian the Maya of the First Age, to rule a realm of her own that embodies the glory of the Eldar days. And now, she is in a position to begin achieving that. In 3,000 years' time, this realm of Galadriel's, the Ninth of Lothlorien, the Dream Flower, will be visited by Frodo Baggins, and when he does, this is what Tolkien wrote. It seemed to him that he had stepped over a bridge of time, into a corner of the elder days, and was now walking in a world that was no more. In Rivendell, there was memory of ancient things. In Lorien, the ancient things still lived on in the waking world. On the land of Lorien, no shadow lay. Inventing a finale to Galadriel's Second Age story arc is undoubtedly a challenge. Tolkien told us so little about her after the Forging of the Rings, but we know where she came from in the First Age, and we know where she'll end up in the Third Age. Back in Season 1, Galadriel's want was to rule a great elven realm that captures some essence of the Elder Days, and she achieves that. But her need was to put aside her ambition and to rule this realm from a place of wisdom, and she achieves that too. Galadriel was never destined to be the queen of a great realm like Eregion, but she will become the guardian of someone else's realm, the Lady of Lothlorien. So, with that in mind, Galadriel's character arc in this show is actually an incredibly positive one. She gets what she wants, and she gets what she needs. And in so doing, she begins to become the Galadriel that we all know and love from The Lord of the Rings. Except, right, I should point out, and I'm aware this is a big thing to casually mention so late in the game, but in the books, Lothlorien totally does have a king at this point in time. His name is Amroth, son of Amdir. We don't have the rights to Amdir, and Amroth has almost nothing to do with the Rings of Power, so I haven't included him in this series, but I don't want to mislead people, so I will say that in the books, Galadriel does still have that exact same character arc that I just explained, but there is an additional step of her guiding this Amroth guy through his time as king of Lothlorien, and then taking over as ruler after he gets himself drowned, almost 2,000 years into the Third Age. But the end result is still the same. Galadriel reluctantly takes over as Lady of the Golden Wood after the previous king is tragically killed. Anyway, back to our many partings in Osgiliath. After all the other major players have departed, it's finally time for Elrond and Círdan and Celebrian and Eärien and Valandil and Soroniel to return north to Rivendell. But Isildur is not going with them. Not yet. He still has a task to do in the south. He must make things right in Gondor before he can take up his father's silver scepter in Arnor. He must train Anarion's heir to succeed him as king of Gondor. But Isildur parts with Eärien and little Valandil on a note of hope. He just has one last thing to do, and then they will all be together again in Arnor, together as a family for the first time in Valandil's life. Isildur kisses Valandil, Eärien kisses her other 3 adult sons, and they all part happy in the knowledge that Elrond and Celebrian and all the elves out of Rivendell will be guiding them safely home. And just before they depart, Isildur should have one last conversation with his buddy Elrond. One last conversation about the ring. Isildur hasn't told anyone else that he has it. He's keeping it secret, and he's keeping it safe. He says that in Gondor he will learn to master it and bend it to his will, or if that cannot be done, he will pass it freely to Elrond, to let the wise do with it as they please. That is the note that they part on. Elrond doesn't love this, but he does trust Isildur, and he wishes him the best of fortune until their next meeting in Rivendell. After that, they part, and the only main characters left in Osgiliath are Isildur, his 3 elder sons, and Meneldiel, son of Anarion. Isildur should take Meneldiel to a silent hallowed hill called Eilinair in the very heart of Gondor's territory, because it is at Eilinair that Elendil's body was secretly entombed by Isildur. This is a holy place, and it will in later days be remembered as Amon Anwar, the Hill of Awe. Within sight of Elendil's resting place, Isildur talks to his nephew about Gondor and its future, and how all of Gondor's kings throughout the rest of its history will be heirs of Meneldil, of the House of Anarion. According to Tolkien's timeline, Isildur spent the first 2 years of the Third Age enhancing and improving Gondor, and making it ready for him to leave it. His sons, Elendur, Aratan, and Cirion, they are the warriors who lead the expedition to reclaim Minas Morgul and to return it to its original station of Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon. The Nazgul have mysteriously faded into shadow and disappeared, and so the Palantir is recovered. The other 5 are freed from Sauron's influence. In addition, a number of towers and fortifications are built both within and around Mordor to keep watch over the Dark Land, and to ensure that no evil could wake there without the men of Gondor knowing it. These towers and fortifications include the Towers of the Teeth, Narcost and Carcost, built on either side of the Black Gate, Durthang overlooking the Vale of Udun, and most iconic of all, the Tower of Cirith Ungol, to guard the Pass of the Spider and establish a Gondorian presence within the confines of Mordor. By the time of The Lord of the Rings, every single one of these Dunedain fortifications will have been conquered and occupied by servants of Sauron, effectively achieving the exact opposite purpose to what they were built for, but right at the beginning of the Third Age, they represent a victory over Sauron, and a perhaps naive hope that the vigilance of the Dunedain would not wane or fail over the next 30 generations. However, the main thing that we should explore during Isildur's last 2 years in Gondor is his relationship with the One Ring. Slowly but surely, it is worming its way into his mind, festering among his thoughts. There is a very important plot point in the second chapter of The Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf recites to Frodo what he found in a lost scroll written 3,000 years ago by Isildur. It's because of this scroll that Bilbo's magic invisibility ring is confirmed to be Sauron's ruling ring. And in those Lord of the Rings writings, Isildur tells us that the ring was hot when I first took it, hot as a gleed, and my hand was scorched, so that I doubt if ever again I shall be free of the pain of it. This is a cool thing, I think, to explore. Isildur's study into the nature of the One Ring causes him such pain that he believes he will never be free of it. He learns the very hard way that he cannot master the ring or use it the way Sauron did. It still misses the heat of his hand. And yet, despite the hurt that it causes, Isildur still has the foresight to record all his findings, to make note of the fact that if it is cast into fire, elvish letters are revealed. He transcribes those letters, and because he does, eventually Gandalf will be able to begin the process of getting this ring unmade. It'll take 3,000 years to pay off, but this scroll, this first-hand study into the properties of the One Ring, is among some of the most important things Isildur ever does for the future of Middle-earth. And considering it's Isildur we're talking about, that's saying a lot. If there's time, we can also potentially tie up that Oathbreakers subplot. You know, they did not come to fight Sauron when called upon, and thus Isildur holds their oaths unfulfilled. The men who swore their oath upon the Stone of Erech are now bound to it, doomed to haunt that passage in the White Mountains forever, unable to pass beyond the circles of the world until an heir of Isildur's should come along to set them free. But I think Isildur's last big scene in Gondor should be a private moment of dialogue between him and his eldest son Elendur. Tolkien wrote that Isildur revealed the truth of the ring to no one in Gondor save for Elendur alone. He was the only person among all the Dunedain who knew that it existed and that it was born by his father Isildur. But I imagine that in the scene in which Isildur tells Elendur about this secret heirloom of his house, things should take a slightly sinister turn. We know very little about Elendur, and I certainly don't want to go painting him in a negative light, but I think that as soon as he sees the One Ring with his own eyes, he should counsel Isildur to tell no one else about it, especially not Aratan or Cirion. If they knew that such a prize could be theirs to claim upon Isildur's death, surely they could not be trusted. Throughout every scene that the sons of Isildur have featured in, they've been super close, super loyal brothers in arms with no hint of treachery whatsoever among them. But as soon as the One Ring comes into play, all ambition is exacerbated, ruthlessness turns up to 11, and all thoughts turn towards notions of treachery. And I'm not inventing this entirely out of nothing. In the Lord of the Rings appendices, we are told that after Isildur's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson died, his 3 sons did all go to war with each other, and the great realm of Arnor was broken into 3 quarrelling kingdoms. This was the beginning of the end for the North Kingdom of the Dunedain, and it all happened because 3 heirs of Isildur couldn't agree which one of them would inherit the Palantir of Weathertop. Imagine how much more awful that conflict would have been, and how much sooner it would have occurred if they were fighting over the One Ring instead. I'm definitely not suggesting there should be any real conflict between the sons of Isildur, but I think it's important that Isildur realizes conflict would be inevitable if he were to keep the One Ring as an heirloom of his house. Listening to his beloved son Elendur voice fears of treachery from his beloved brothers Aratan and Cirion is what should finally convince Isildur of perhaps the most universal truth in all of Tolkien's writings: Círdan is always right. The One Ring can never be an heirloom of the House of Isildur. It can only be his bane. He saw what happened in Númenor. He had a front row seat to the doom that is wrought when kings of Númenor are deceived by the will of Sauron. Even if he were never corrupted, and Elendur were never corrupted, and none of his grandchildren were ever corrupted, eventually the ring would be claimed by someone who would be. And it would end with another Pharazôn. On his last night in Gondor, Isildur looks west and he makes the right decision. The One Ring must leave Gondor, and it must leave the possession of the Dunedain entirely. In Isildur's own words, it should go to the Keepers of the Three. In the story that Tolkien wrote, that was Isildur's intent. Do not be fooled by Peter Jackson's movies. Isildur's character arc is not a downward moral trajectory of corruption. He does not fall into villainy by claiming the ring for himself. Isildur's story is a bittersweet tale of a tragic hero, resisting the evil that's plagued his family and his people and his nation for thousands of years. Now, we could never say for sure whether Isildur would have actually given up the ring or not if push came to shove, but that was his intent. And, as I'm sure you all know, the reason we can't say what would have actually happened is because Isildur never faces this test. He is not destined to make it to Rivendell. In the morning, Isildur and his sons and his guard of knights from Ardenor bid their final farewells to Gondor's new king, Meneldiel, and they journey north, away from Osgiliath, up the river Anduin, and beyond the borders of Gondor. One day, Isildur's likeness will be carved along this river in the form of the Argonath, but Isildur himself will never come back to this land. He and his men continue on, up into the wilds of Rovanion, following the river Anduin. And as they make the journey north, I think it should be raining. I'm aware that's an oddly specific detail to add, but the power in water is something I've talked about a lot already while discussing Númenóreans, and we'll see it again in this scene, but also, for more practical reasons, as Isildur reaches the point where the river Gladden meets the river Anduin, we need to see that the great river has been swollen by the downpour. The mighty Anduin has turned into a great torrent of water. But it's at this point where the Gladden meets the Anduin that we find the Gladden Fields. And, unfortunately, the Gladden Fields are where this story reaches its climax and then comes to an end. There is a chapter in the Unfinished Tales called The Disaster of the Gladden Fields, and if rights weren't an issue, I would adapt this chapter as faithfully as possible. It is the best way to tie up Isildur's character arc, and the story of the Second Age as a whole. Unfortunately, we live in a silly world where that's not the case, and so some specifics can't be used, but for the purposes of this video, the entire Gladden Fields scene does need to be built around the core themes that Tolkien explored in his version. At the end of another long day's march, Isildur and his company rest, and we get to see their final moments of joy together. Then, out of the blackness, comes a war band of orcs. Remember that orc warband that I mentioned in the last video? The ones who were sent by Sauron into the Misty Mountains before the war began? The ones who were going to attack Isildur and Elrond's vanguard upon the High Pass, but then fled at the sight of them due to the self-defeating nature of evil? Well, this is the point of that. 10 years later, these orcs are still here, still waiting to do the Dark Lord's will. Tolkien wrote, in regards to these orcs who ambush Isildur, that there was not only cunning in the attack, but fierce and relentless hatred. The orcs of the mountains were stiffened and commanded by grim servants of Barad-dûr, sent out long before to watch the passes, and though it was unknown to them, the ring was still laden with Sauron's evil will and called to all his servants for their aid. So, the orcs don't consciously realize it, but it is the one ring around Isildur's neck that's calling to them and inflaming their ferocity and hatred. The one ring betrays Isildur. The Unfinished Tales give us some more really cool details about the specifics of this disastrous battle at the Gladden Fields, but one of the most important details is also mentioned in The Lord of the Rings, so we totally have the rights to use it. At the Council of Elrond, we are told that Isildur once had a dear friend and an esquire called Otar. Actually, Otar is probably more of a title than a name, but that's not important. The reason Otar matters is because he was with Isildur at the Gladden Fields, and he was one of the only men to escape that battle alive. As the orcs close in, and Isildur realizes that his guards are outnumbered 10-1, he removes the ring of Barahir from his finger. He summons his squire Otar, and he delivers into Otar's keeping the shards of Narsil. Isildur commands Otar to take the broken sword and the ring of Barahir too, and to save them from capture no matter what. He says these heirlooms are more important than any one person's life, so long as the ring of Barahir and the broken sword and the silver scepter of Silmarillane belong to the Dunedain, their people will have a future. So, upon Isildur's orders, Otar flees into the darkness, and the rest of the Dunedain remain to cover his escape. But the orcs just keep on coming. They are no match at all for the might of the men of Arnor, but for every 5 orcs that are slain, 10 more take their place, and the power of the ring is driving them to an almost suicidal level of hatred and aggression. Eventually, Isildur's second son, Cirion, is slain by the overwhelming number of enemies, and the third son, Aratan, he is mortally wounded too, trying to save his brother. Isildur, of course, fights valiantly, but all around him men drop dead. When only a handful remain, his eldest son, Elendur, comes to his side and speaks his final words to his father. "My king," he says, "Cirion is dead and Aratan is dying. Your last counselor must advise, nay command you, as you commanded Otar, go, take your burden and at all costs bring it to the keepers, even at the cost of abandoning your men and me." Alright, those exact words are from the Unfinished Tale, so we probably can't use them verbatim, but the point we need to convey is the immensity of the sacrifice that both Isildur and Elendur are making in this moment. For a warrior king like Isildur to abandon not only his sons, but all the rest of his men, that would go against every instinct of honor that he has. And yet Elendur is right. Isildur has to get the One Ring out of here. He has to ensure it's not taken by orcs. That matters more than anything else in Middle-earth. Isildur kisses his son. He begs Elendur's forgiveness for the doom that he's led him to, and then Elendur is slain. Isildur sees that the battle is lost and he has no choice but to put aside his pride and disappear. So, for the final time in his life, Isildur sets the One Ring upon his finger, and when he does, he is never seen by any elf or man ever again. Just try putting yourself in Isildur's mindset here. He is wearing the ring, which not only causes him agonizing physical pain, but it also massively enhances any and all anguish of heart. His eldest 3 sons have all just been killed. The last of his men are still dying, and he is alone in the wild, full of despair, knowing that if he fails to escape the orcs, all of Middle-earth will suffer the consequences. At last, a desperate Isildur arrives at the west bank of the Anduin River. He can hear orcs snuffling behind him. Even while invisible, they can still track him. He stares into the raging waters and then leaps into the Anduin. Which brings us to, perhaps, the most important scene in the entire show. The moment when the One Ring slips from Isildur's finger. Within Tolkien's writings, there are actually quite a few different accounts of exactly what happens here, and depending on which version we go with, it completely changes the impact that this moment has on the wider story. In the Shadow of the Past chapter, Gandalf tells us that the ring was trying to get back to its master. It had slipped from Isildur's hand and betrayed him. But Gandalf doesn't know this, he wasn't there, and if the ring did slip from Isildur's finger as an act of treachery to return to its master, it did a terrible job. From the perspective of Sauron, the ring getting lost in the Anduin is the worst thing that could have possibly happened. It is the first link in the chain of events which ultimately ends with the ring's destruction. In other writings, Tolkien gave us a much more detailed and, in my mind, much more intriguing insight into what was really going on when Isildur lost the ring. We are told that Isildur was swept by the Anduin down towards the tangles of the Gladden Fields. There, suddenly, he knew that the ring had gone. By chance, or chance well used, it had left his hand and gone where he could never hope to find it again. At first, so overwhelming was his sense of loss that he struggled no more, and would have sunk and drowned, but, swift as it had come, the mood passed. The pain had left him. A great burden had been taken away. This passage is crucial in telling Isildur's story. The implication from Tolkien is that it wasn't the malice of Sauron that swept the ring from Isildur's finger, it was chance well used, aka Ilúvatar. The same Ilúvatar who drowned the nation of Númenor but spared Isildur and the faithful. The same Ilúvatar whom Elros and Tarmiriel surrendered their spirits to in earlier seasons. In his final moments of life, Isildur is set free by Ilúvatar. The ring is taken from him by the Anduin, and his pain is taken too. His anguish is gone, and his burden is lost. Isildur clambers onto the shore. He looks up at a single star behind the clouds, and for a moment he is at peace. He breathes deep the night air. He feels the rain on his skin. His crown flashes in the moonlight. And then he is shot through the heart by a night-eyed orc. Isildur dies instantly. He falls backward and his body is claimed by the great river, never to be looked upon ever again by elf or man or orc. And the reason this strikes me as such a profound climax for this show isn't just because it's the death of a major character, it's because in this moment Tolkien gives us an opportunity to showcase 3 of the most important themes in this whole story. First, we see the self-defeating nature of evil. At a glance, ending things with the death of Isildur may seem like a bit of a downer, like the orcs won, the good guys lose, what was the point of those 50 hours that got us here? But that's not how this ending should be directed. That does not reflect what this moment represents in Tolkien's writings. In the last video, I mentioned how this orc warband that killed Isildur were sent into the Misty Mountains before the War of the Last Alliance began, under instructions from Sauron to ambush and attack the armies of the Alliance before they made it to Mordor. But the orcs did not do that. If they had been more faithful to Sauron, they'd have given their lives trying to take down Isildur 10 years ago. Maybe they would have succeeded, probably not, but either way, they would not have survived to be alive in this moment. But that's the point. The orcs aren't faithful to Sauron, they are fearful of him. They are hateful and evil, but they are also cowards, with next to nothing in the way of morale. And turns out, fear of a master many hundreds of leagues away simply isn't a strong enough motivator for these orcs to give their lives in his service. So, they didn't ambush Isildur 10 years ago when he was leading the vanguard over the High Pass. And because of that cowardice, Isildur lived long enough to cut the ring from Sauron's finger. Now, that High Pass Vanguard thing, that was invented by me, not by Tolkien, but it exists solely to set up and explore a much deeper perspective on this theme right now, in this moment of Isildur's death, and that very much was put there by Tolkien. Check out this author's note explaining what the orcs were thinking at the moment when they ambushed Isildur's host. In Tolkien's words, "It is unlikely that any news of Sauron's fall had reached them. Probably they thought that Sauron had been victorious, and the war-scarred army of Thranduil was retreating to hide in the fastness of the forest. Thus they would be emboldened and eager to win their master's praise, though they had not been in the main battles. But it was not his praise they would have won, if any had lived long enough to see his revival. No tortures would have satisfied his anger with the bungling fools who had let slip the greatest prize in Middle-earth. These orcs that kill Isildur are not doing good things for Sauron by getting his ring lost in the Anduin. As I've said, from the perspective of Sauron's not yet utterly vanquished spirit, this is the worst thing that could have happened. Gandalf says it best in Return of the King: "A traitor may betray himself, and do good he does not intend." If Isildur survived the disaster of the Gladden Fields, he would have either claimed the ring for himself, which would have brought absolute ruin to the Dunedain. It would have birthed another Pharazôn, except probably worse, and before too long, Sauron would have reclaimed his ring and used it to dominate all of Middle-earth. Or maybe Isildur would have genuinely relinquished the ring to either Elrond or Círdan or Galadriel, in which case things might have been a bit more difficult for Sauron, but realistically, within a few centuries, an elven ringlord would have done his work for him, and Sauron would have ended up back on top. But this? The ring lost in the Anduin? No, this is a disaster for Sauron. Thanks to these hateful, cowardly orcs, Sauron will never see his ring again. It will be out of play for 2,641 years before it will be found, and because it is found, it will be unmade in the very fires that forged it. And the ultimate defeat that Sauron's been trying to hold off since he first joined forces with Morgoth will eventually catch up to him. If he didn't have such hateful servants as orcs, it would have been better for Sauron. If he hadn't been so awful to everyone, it would have been better for Sauron. If he had humbled himself and begged the pardon of the Valar back at the end of the First Age, it would have been better for Sauron. But no, he achieved greatness through evil, but it was always in opposition to Ilúvatar. So, in the end, he defeated himself. The second theme Tolkien allows us to explore with Isildur's final moment is one that I have come to thoroughly enjoy over the span of making these videos. Because the ring is not lost in a desert, or buried in the earth, or encased in mithril, or anything like that. It is lost in the Anduin, taken into the care of the Great River. And this is awesome because, say it with me people, there is power in water. And water beats gold. Gold is, in Tolkien's words, the Morgoth element. But Morgoth's corrupting influence is entirely absent from water. In many instances throughout Tolkien's writings, gold corrupts, but water washes corruption away. So much of the Númenor story back in seasons 3 and 4 had a massive focus on water as a symbol of the Valar, or Ilúvatar, or some, unnamed for legal reasons, higher power that represents the truth to which Sauron and Morgoth are opposed. And so I absolutely love that water is so all-important to the climax of the whole story. In the most important 5 seconds of the entire 5 seasons, it is the water of the Anduin that brings this tale of the Rings of Power to an end. Which brings us to the third and most important of all the themes not only showcased in this scene, but in the entire show. The point, the central theme. Death is a gift for Isildur. I know this may seem like a very sad ending for a TV show, and true, it's not exactly feel-good uplifting, but if we consider all the other potential alternatives, I truly do believe this is the best thing that could have happened to Isildur. He died free. His burden and his pain and his torment were taken from him with the ring. He was never forced to face the impossible test of giving it up. He never endured the centuries of deathlessness and corruption that it would have brought to him. The free peoples never suffered the tyranny that a Dunedain ringlord would have inevitably brought about. He died Isildur. And there's no way that could have been the case if anything were different. Which is cool because there is another character in Tolkien's writings whose kind of climax of the story bears a striking resemblance to Isildur's. Check out this paragraph from The Lord of the Rings. It's right at the end of the Mount Doom chapter, after Frodo has claimed the ring for his own, after Gollum has shown up and bitten it from his finger, after he's fallen back into the cracks of doom, and the mountain belches fire, and the skies burst into thunder and lightning, and the Nazgûl come shooting like flaming bolts, but are caught in the fiery ruin of the hill. In that moment of absolute cataclysm, Sam Gamgee hears a voice by his side. Well, this is the end, Sam Gamgee. And there was Frodo, pale and worn, and yet himself again. And in his eyes, there was peace now. Neither strain of will, nor madness, nor any fear. His burden was taken away. There was the dear master of the sweet days in the Shire. Both Frodo and Isildur lose the ring in what could at first glance be considered an absolute disaster, but it is not so. Thanks to the intervention of a higher power, the designs of Ilúvatar, both Frodo and Isildur are finally set free. Just like Tar Miriel back in Season 4, and even Elros at the beginning of Seasons 1 and 3, the point of Isildur's death isn't so much that his body is killed, it's that his spirit is returned to Ilúvatar. It is bittersweet, but that's kind of the point. Mortals must die. Such is our nature. But if the ring had remained on Isildur's finger, it would have robbed him of Ilúvatar's gift, at least for a while. But that's not how it went. The ring slipped from him, it was lost in the river, and now Isildur rests in peace. And that is not a bad thing. But it is the end of Isildur. His body sinks into the depths of the Anduin, his spirit departs the circles of the world, and the ring disappears for millennia. Which brings us to the final scene before the epilogue. A scene to bookend how this whole thing began. One last perspective on the final conversation between Elrond and Elros. Except, this time, it's not Elrond the Deathless and his twin brother Elros the Elderly. Now it's Elrond the Deathless and his many times great nephew, Valandil. At most a 13-year-old child, or potentially even younger, depending on how we handle the time jumps. But he is an heir of Elros, last surviving child of Isildur. We should see that squire of Isildur's Otar return to Imladris, as he was bidden, bearing the shards of Narsil and the ring of Barahir. These heirlooms of Númenor he gives to Elrond, and Elrond places them with the silver scepter of the Dúnedain, which Elendil left in Rivendell before setting off to war. 3 heirlooms of Silmarien, heirlooms of the faithful, heirlooms of Elendil, heirlooms of Elros, heirlooms of Númenor and the Dúnedain, but under the protection of Elrond Half-Elven in Rivendell. Elrond summons Valandil and his mother Eärien to the Hall of Fire, and there he gently tells the boy why these heirlooms matter. He comforts Valandil and Eärien in their time of grief, and they all mourn for Isildur together, but the point of this scene is that Elrond gives to Valandil the ring of Barahir and the shards of Narsil, and he tells the boy that when he comes of age, and he's ready to take the crown of Arnor from his grandmother Soroniel, he will inherit the silver scepter too. Young Valandil stands with his mother Eärien. He holds the ring of Barahir in one hand, and the broken sword of his grandfather Elendil in the other. And then Elrond kneels before him. He places Barahir's ring upon the child's finger, and he gives his word that for every day of Valandil's long life and reign, and throughout every day of his children's lives, and his grandchildren's, and his great-grandchildren's for millennia to come, Elrond will be there, an eternal friend to the Dúnedain in their times of need, a guardian of the house of Isildur. And so that is effectively the end of the story. It began with Elrond and Elros, and I think it should end with Elrond and Valandil. From the mortal perspective of a Númenorian, 25 generations have come and gone between this scene and the first one. It's been 3,500 years, but from the immortal perspective of Elrond, it's all part of the same long conversation about death and deathlessness. A conversation that will continue for another 3,000 years, until eventually these opposing concepts of death and deathlessness will collide once again in Elrond's family when his immortal daughter Arwen marries Isildur's mortal heir Aragorn in the final years of the Third Age. However, there is still one last scene that I really want to include, not so much an ending as an epilogue. Because this show is called Rings of Power, and there is still one last wrinkle in that story before the stuff we're all familiar with from The Lord of the Rings. So, as we fade out for the final time on Elrond and the heirlooms of the Dunedain and Eärien with her young son Valandil, we should see waves gently break upon the shore. A white-haired figure stands by the water's edge and watches a boat sail towards him from the west. Before we see the figure's face, we see his hand and Narya, the ring of fire upon his finger. Then, on the screen appears the words, 1,000 years later. Círdan the Shipwright, Lord of the Grey Havens, is alone when this mysterious boat makes land. He is the only person to see who the boat is carrying. An old man, or so he appears, bent, bearded, and robed in grey. Círdan welcomes this grey pilgrim. He alone of all people in Middle-earth does not need to be told why this old man has come. His true name is not revealed, but in Círdan's elvish language, Grey Pilgrim is translated as Mithrandir. Círdan removes Narya from his finger. He looks deep into the kind eyes of this Grey Pilgrim, and he surrenders his ring of power to this newcomer. He says, "Take this ring, master, for your labours will be heavy, but it will support you in the weariness that you have taken upon yourself. For this is the ring of fire, and with it you may rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill." The Grey Pilgrim takes Círdan's ring of power. He sets it upon his finger, and then, without speaking a word, he sets off on a journey away from the sea and into the heartlands of Middle-earth, where we all know he is destined to begin a series of events which will one day culminate with Mr. Bilbo Baggins finding a magical ring in a cave beneath the misty mountains, and the rest after that is history. This epilogue isn't so much an ending to our Rings of Power story, it's more of a hinge that connects our story to the Lord of the Rings. With the arrival of this wandering wizard, a new story has now begun, and the Rings of Power is over. I obviously have no idea if this is the scene that the actual Rings of Power show intends to end on, but everything I've just said is taken directly from the appendices, so there's no reason why this can't be the final ending. And I'm not saying there's no other way the show could end. There are loads of other scenes that could work really well as the last one. But I think that in the moment Círdan surrenders his ring to Gandalf, this Second Age story turns into a different Third Age story. There's still so much awesome stuff that happens after this moment, but I would argue that it all belongs in a different show. As Gandalf enters Middle-earth, the screen should fade to black, and the credits begin to roll. But still not quite the end of this video, because I am such a massive nerd when it comes to things like opening and closing credits, and I firmly believe that even just a load of names appearing on the screen is still an opportunity for storytelling. It may sound a bit bizarre, but one of my favourite parts of the Return of the King movie is the end credits. I think the filmmakers did a really good job at turning something potentially mundane into a really memorable ending. So, I would suggest that as the credits roll, and some very talented musician sings, I don't know, whatever song's been written for this purpose, we should see that the names of the cast and creatives are appearing over a series of still images, and these images tell a story. The first one should be an artistic rendering of an image that we've just seen moments ago in this episode, our last shot in Rivendell. Elrond stands with the 3 heirlooms of the Dunedain, and before him is Eärien with her young son Valandil. Then we see Annúminas, but no longer in its prime, followed by 3 kings of Ardenor in a time of war. The image after that is Osgiliath, but in ruins, followed by the Witch King of Angmar holding 2 crowns. We then see Rangers of the North protecting the ruins of Ardenor and a strange new group of people who have come to live there. We see a steward of Gondor making an alliance with a great horse lord. And finally, we see the last image in the sequence, which is almost exactly the same as the first one. Elrond in Rivendell with the 3 heirlooms of the Dunedain. But where Eärien stood, there is now a different woman, called Gilrain. And where Valandil once stood, there is now a different child called Aragorn. He who is destined to one day rule the Dunedain as High King Elessar, the 3rd High King of both Ardenor and Gondor, the heir of Elendil and Isildur, the king for whom the broken blade shall be reforged. The ring of Barahir will be gifted by him to the elf maiden Arwen Undomiel as a token of their engagement. And on the day of their wedding, the silver scepter of the Dunedain's kings shall be given by Elrond to Aragorn, the heir of Isildur. Obviously, that's not an easy thing to communicate via the end credits, and almost everyone isn't going to watch the end credits, which is absolutely fair enough, but there will be some people who do, and hopefully a few of those people will be nerdy enough to figure out what these images mean. They give a very brief overview of 3,000 years of Dunedain history between the ending of the Second Age and the ending of the Third Age. And hopefully they will illustrate how this Rings of Power story connects to the future stories. And ideally they will cast a new light on the tales of the Ring and the Sword, the 2 halves that make up the Lord of the Rings. So, that is it. Those are my thoughts on how a 5-season Second Age TV series could be faithfully written in such a way that I really hope does justice to Tolkien's writings, as opposed to kind of just steamrolling over them. You don't need to compress the timeline. You don't need to make these legacy characters unrecognizable from what Tolkien wrote. You don't need to project your own thing onto The Lord of the Rings, which totally does have enough information to adapt a Second Age show. You don't need to try and improve upon Tolkien. I've said it a number of times throughout these videos, but it really has struck me whilst making them that in many instances, the Second Age really does kind of adapt itself. These stories are universal, they are mythological, they are relevant not only to everyone alive today, they are relevant to everyone throughout history. Surely, that's what makes them timeless. Anyway, let's not go on a rant at the end of a 12-hour series of videos. If you enjoyed The Rings of Power, great. If you enjoyed this series of videos, great. And if your journey into Middle-earth has inspired you to explore more of Tolkien's writings, then that is exceptionally great. So, hit the like button and leave a comment on this video if you did enjoy this series, and if you haven't already, hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss anything coming in the future. But, my dear friends, thank you so much for watching this series, and as always, until next time, to all of you, much love. Stay groovy, and Navair Melanin.